They haven't been provided with the infrastructure,
Yeah,
with the ability to have the correlation and
yeah.
question of
And
causality.
then change management is an interesting one. Um, I think so. That leaves us with operations,
Mm-hmm.
right? And at the end of the day, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if you roll up sales and operations, or basically whatever makes, these are the people who find a way to make things work,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when IT is not giving them the tools that they need, they spend the weekend and build something in Excel,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to run my company, I'd be looking at those folks, because these people who that's their world, business outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you live in operations, if you're talking to customers, you have the chops, you have the understanding, you have the discipline, you have the mentality of making sure that everything you do results in a business outcome. And the other that's interesting is marketing.
Let me introduce that one
Yeah.
too. Let me just hear myself rationalize through that
Mm-hmm.
as well, because it brings back, the as I was a contributor for Inc. and hundreds of interviews, the co-author of a book, Science of Story, and our thesis, right, in that book, and a lot of it was where do stories come from? How do the chief storytellers, whether look at it as chief marketing officers, how do they communicate?
Mm-hmm.
And we said brand is a reflection of culture. There was actually a quote by one of the Kellogg executives. But I like that when a couple days ago you were like, brand is a reflection of culture. I see it differently.
Yeah.
How do you see it before I kind of jump back into the rest of this?
Well, I was taught, and I agree with that brand is a promise, right? So when you think about Volvo, the brand stands for safety. When you talk about BMW, the promise is, what is it? Performance machine, ultimate performance
That's
machine,
right.
right?
Yep.
You think about Toyota, you think about reliability, right? So I don't really know whether the culture of Volvo versus General Motors versus Toyota versus Mercedes are any different, right? So to me, brand is about what promise do I make to the consumer, and then doing everything I do that's consumer facing to reinforce that promise and not breaking that promise.
And this is the interesting piece, because now we're looking at the people related challenges reaching a boiling point. And I think that as they scratch their head and they say, okay, if brand is a reflection of its promise, just for a second, kind of taking that theme,
Mm-hmm.
you then ask, how does the customer experience that promise?
Yeah.
Well, they experience it through the employees of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And if the employees of the organizations are don't experience the culture, I think is a bit of a all-encompassing catchword. But if they don't experience the culture that helps them activate their behaviors in order for them to be able to deliver the promise to the customers,
Mm-hmm.
then the organization fails, because brand isn't a reflection of culture. But it's not here or there, because we're in the same zip codes.
Yeah.
Where I want to go next is, or where my mind went next, is to say, okay, when we launched years ago, Prohabits was this idea that when you have a purpose and values and leadership behaviors, and when you're trying to create a culture, you create a lot of these moments, right? Moments, the executives, keynotes, speakers come in. We worked with Simon Sinek, Jennifer Brown, lots of speakers over the years.
Yeah.
And we asked the question of what happens the day after, right? What happens the day after these inspiring events? And again, as a co-founder of an agency, like, I left that thinking aside. I wasn't converging the thoughts. I just stayed with what happens the day after these moments.
Mm-hmm.
But recently, in conclusion of the season, thinking about consumerization, I began to ask the question of, what's the role of the CMO for internal audiences? Or in other words, when they think about their world of being a storyteller, is it as simple as saying, let's add a new audience, right? The audience externally, there are audiences. It's not one audience. There are current customers, past customers. They're divided into segments, locations, and so on. Why don't you think about a new audience? And then you said, well, marketing isn't business outcomes, right? They are also in the world of a bit of the leading indicators,
Mm-hmm.
right? Remind me kind of how you wanted the positioning that marketing is also one step removed from the outcome.
Yeah. Well, we talked about how marketing had to change to be more outcome driven, to be able to demonstrate their effectiveness based on sales number instead of the leading indicators.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, if you talk to marketing executives and marketing functions, they don't sell, right? So even though they'll go in and do their MMM model and they say we need to do this and spend more money on TV here and more of this there and blah blah blah, at the end of the day, they don't control the sales process. Completely different function. So they also have plausible deniability and say, hey, we did what we were supposed to be doing, but salespeople screwed it up, or something else happened, right? So, but what's interesting is, because we talked about who in an organization has the mindset and would be able to actually run a program like this, and it makes sense that it's a marketer, right? Because they understand the data part, they understand the behavior part, they understand the engagement part. Like, they live in this world, the digital marketing people have lived in this for 20 years. What's missing is the business outcome ownership, right? And I was thinking about how, 20, 30 years ago, Microsoft Excel came in, right? So Excel comes in, the tool comes in, you have a bunch of people who do all the finance on a piece of paper, and now they need an Excel. Well, they can't run Excel. They need to install Excel. They need to apply service packs, right? So IT then becomes an enabler, right? So IT they know how to use Excel. They know how to install Excel. They know everything there is about Excel. They just don't know how to use Excel to create an income statement. Right?
Let's look at it this way.
Similar with marketing, right? Marketing has understanding of the technology. They have all of the qualifications to do this. They just don't know how to improve turnover because they don't understand the business side of it. So similar to how IT became an enabler of finance, right? And now, if you look at finance, you have ERP system, you have all the systems. IT is an integral part of finance. IT is an integral part of sales. IT is an integral part of PMO, right? Now we have maybe potentially marketing is an enabler of people initiatives, right? Is there a room to rethink about role of marketing organization instead of saying marketing is a 100% external function, marketing only services the consumers, right? Is there a room to say, hey, if we have these people with this amazing skill sets who gets the data, who get the behavior science, and who understand the levers, and who understand the channel and the engagement side and the operations side, right? Because they run campaigns, they pivot often, they do the A/B testing, they do all the things that are necessary to impact your intended audience, right? They have the know-how. So I don't know if they're able to drive those processes, those initiatives, but they potentially there is a room for them to become an enabler, right? So in this new world, whoever owns the outcome, that extended team has the IT resource and a marketing resource, right? And I think of a skill set, not necessarily organizationally, but that sort of skill set on the team, right?
It's kind of like, currently they look at whatever product or service the company offers. They look at the operational folks and they talk about what are we releasing, what is our roadmap if it's a product or services, how are we different, how are we positioning? So they rely on them, and those are the people that then deliver on the promise. So the question now is, will they look at the CHRO and say, okay, what are the business outcomes? How are we thinking about these audience? What are we trying to accomplish?
I think in season 2, there's an opportunity to really explore this, whether companies leave a lot on the table by not tapping into the wealth of potential value sitting in their marketing organization and figuring out how to put that to work, not only externally but also internally. And I think as we explore this, I think there's going to be a lot of aha and gotchas and a lot of aha moments on figuring out how to use this existing resource instead of building out a completely new set of skill sets and completely new set of organizational departments. The question is, do you already have all the pieces in place? Right? Maybe there is a little bit of rewiring that needs to happen, mind change needs to happen, because every time you're trying to do something that requires, like I can't go and practice law. Like, it's a skill set that takes years. It's not just knowledge. I can read all the law books, right?
No,
But
for
it's a skill
sure.
set that takes years to hone.
It's a
Right.
capability also not of one person, but lots of
Exactly.
people who writes content, who does the images.
Exactly.
But most importantly, you start
Yeah.
at the strategic level. Who's going to create the roadmap
Exactly.
for us? And about the same, about a week prior to you and I having that discussion, one of the guests sent me a link to an article that talked about Linda Buff, the CMO of GE. I actually had the opportunity to interview her about 6 or 7 years ago for Inc. And she took on the role of also being the vice president of learning and culture, right? In addition to being
Yeah.
the CMO. And this is a little excerpt that I think is super beneficial. As the vice president of learning and culture, Buff will lead learning and development for the company's 300,000 employees worldwide. She also will assume responsibility for actually that's not as relevant. So my point is there is already signals that are starting
Yeah.
to emerge that marketing can play a critical role in the people
Yes.
initiatives.
But I think the challenge is that the rest of the enterprise does not understand what those guys do and where else they can help out. So we're seeing strong relationship marketing in IT, strong relationship marketing in sales, and that's it. So I think there is a huge opportunities for companies, right, in terms of the skill set. So we have to figure out, hopefully in season 2 we'll get closer as to who should own it, right? So we rattled off a couple of Atlanta businesses. Me being the CEO roles and running organizations, I'd be more comfortable if ops owned it, because at the end of the day, ops has to deliver something every day, right? They can't survive activity based. We talked about that. Ops is all outcome based, right? So I'd feel more comfortable that it will get done if it sits in ops. But I'm not a thought leader in the space. Would be interesting to see. And number 2 is, once we figure out who owns it and who drives it, what that ideal makeup of the team is. So we talked about cross-functional. That seems to be table stakes at this point. It's been validated through God knows how many conversations. So the idea that we need the data cross-functional across multiple phases and multiple steps of the employee experience, that makes perfect sense. But then where does marketing come in?
And let's remember the 4 pillars of people initiatives, right? If we're moving toward a world where its success is measured by business outcomes, right? Marketing check. Like they understand how to become at least the leading indicator to that.
Exactly.
The decisions are data driven, check. Marketing folks are data driven to the core. Communication is hyper personalized. Who knows more about personalization or meeting the pressure of consumerization than them?